William Faulkner. Say the name. And you're immediately dropped into this world of dusty Mississippi history, dense, almost suffocating prose, and family tragedies so tangled they seem to defy time itself.
They really do. He's one of the 20th century's most celebrated, influential, and, let's be honest, most intensely challenging American writers.
Absolutely. He is, without much exaggeration, the writer who laid the foundation for basically all serious Southern literature that came after him.
Right, but for a figure of such monumental genius, his biography is just a cascade of contradictions. It's really kind of amazing.
I mean, we're talking about a high modernist genius who failed to graduate from high school.
And a literary giant who told these incredible tall tales about being a decorated war hero, but he never even saw combat.
Exactly. And this fiercely private artist who then spends years, reluctantly, working as a Hollywood screenwriter just to keep his family afloat.
It's that contradiction that's so fascinating. Our source material today gives us this dense chronological and thematic breakdown of his very complex life and work.
So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack these massive contradictions. We want to reveal how a man with such profound, personal flaws and eccentricities managed to create this universal human landscape.
We're tracing his journey from rural Oxford, Mississippi, all the way to the Nobel Prize stage.
And while we do that, we're going to try to understand how he constructed his greatest, most monumental fictional creation, the entirely self-contained world he called Yoknapatawpha County.
That county, Yoknapatawpha, is the single most crucial concept to understanding Faulkner. It's an intensely detailed, contained world, a fictionalized version of his own hometown, Lafayette County, Mississippi.
He famously called it his postage stamp of soil.
Exactly, just 2,400 square miles with an initial population of, I think, 15,611 persons. He specified it on a map he drew himself.
That's incredible detail.
It is. And onto that tiny piece of earth, he managed to impose the entire tragic history of the South, fitting every possible dimension of the human condition: racial strife, tragedy, comedy, history, violence onto it. So let's unpack the man who built that world.
Okay, so we have to begin with the roots. William Faulkner was born William Cuthbert Faulkner with a K in New Albany in 1897. But he was raised in Oxford, Mississippi.
And the sources note his family was part of the upper middle class, but they were, and this is a key phrase, not quite of the old feudal cotton aristocracy.
So they were comfortable, but they didn't have that ancient social standing of the decaying families he'd later write about, like the Compsons or the Sartorises.
That position is so instructive, isn't it? It gave him an insider's view of the social hierarchy, but he was still slightly detached. He was an observer, not a full participant in the Old South's self-mythology.
And his childhood was just steeped in the oral history of his elders. We're talking stories that span the Civil War, the brutal legacy of slavery, and even the history of the Ku Klux Klan.
He was inheriting a history that was heavy, unresolved, and incredibly dramatic.
And the greatest influence on this inherited drama was definitely his paternal great-grandfather and namesake, William Clark Faulkner. The Colonel.
The Colonel. I mean, this figure is ripped straight from Southern mythology. He was a genuine frontier archetype.
Born into poverty, right. And worked his way up.
Worked his way up to become a Confederate colonel, a strict disciplinarian. His life was just marked by extreme violence and ambition. The sources detail how he was tried and acquitted not once, but twice on charges of murder. Twice. Before he was ultimately murdered himself by a former business partner in a street gunfight.
You can't make this up. He built a railroad, founded a town,
and wrote a hugely popular romantic novel, The White Rose of Memphis. The man's life story is literally the blueprint for the great, tragic Southern families Faulkner wrote about.
Absolutely. The ambition, the rise, and the tragic sudden fall, it's all there.
It's the immediate genesis of Colonel John Sartoris in Sartoris and Absalom. His influence permeates the entire narrative of Southern decline and inherited guilt that defines Yoknapatawpha.
So for Faulkner, history wasn't just some backdrop. It was a living, inescapable burden passed down through the generations.
Exactly, which is what makes his own formal education so ironic. It was almost the opposite of his literary output, disorganized and, frankly, indifferent.
It's one of the great ironies. The man who crafted some of the most complex sentences in the English language never formally completed high school.
He showed early promise. He skipped the second grade, but by his mid-teens, he just became withdrawn. He spent his time wandering or reading on his own.
And he repeated both the 11th and 12th grades, yet still never got a diploma.
And when he went to college, it wasn't much better. His experience at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, was Well, it was short.
He enrolled in 1919 for just 3 semesters.
Right, and he could attend under a special provision for veterans, which is a whole other layer of myth-making we'll get to. He was pursuing his dream of being a poet.
He did get some early poems published on campus, but his academic record.
Was disastrous. He skipped classes habitually, avoided any courses that required serious effort, and notoriously received a D grade in English composition.
A D in English.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ultimate badge of honor for a self-taught genius who just rejected institutional metrics.
It really is, and you have to layer on top of this the emotional landscape that shaped him, specifically the story of his lost love, Estelle Oldham.
This was hugely formative for his early sort of romantic worldview.
Definitely. Faulkner dated her as a teenager, and she was clearly the great love of his youth, the woman he assumed he would marry. But Estelle came from a much more socially prominent family.
And in 1918, before Faulkner could even propose, she accepted an offer from someone else.
Cornell Franklin, an Ole Miss law grad who was older, much more financially secure, and from a well-respected family. She married stability and social acceptance, leaving Faulkner behind.
And that rejection, the loss of the idealized Southern belle, must have fed directly into the tragic romantic themes in his work.
Oh, absolutely. It fuels that idea of unrequited love and the destructive power of societal expectations that you see all over The Sound and the Fury and Absalom.
Okay, so before we get to the novels themselves, we have to talk about the man who first showed him the path to genius, Phil Stone.
Yes. Faulkner is often seen as this lone artistic wolf, but he had a crucial mentor there in Oxford.
And Phil Stone sounds like the perfect antidote to Faulkner's chaotic education. He was 4 years older, Yale-educated, and he saw Faulkner's raw talent almost immediately.
Stone was his literary bridge. He didn't just encourage Faulkner's poetry, he actively mentored him. He gave him the sophisticated literary education that the university failed to provide.
And crucially, he introduced him to the revolutionary high modernist writers of the day.
Especially James Joyce. That exposure was the single most important factor in Faulkner's stylistic shift away from the Victorian romanticism of his early poems toward the fragmentation and complexity that would define his greatest work.
Stone also championed him relentlessly, even when he was completely unknown.
He did. He made repeated, strenuous efforts to get Faulkner's early work published, but the industry was just not ready for him. The sources confirm he was met with uniform rejection.
So Faulkner spent his early 20s as an aspiring poet who couldn't get any traction at all.
None. And that experience, that complete lack of commercial success for his preferred art form, is vital to understanding the defiance he adopted later.
And speaking of defiance and rejection, let's pivot to the most famous piece of Faulknerian mythmaking, his invented military career during World War I. This is where he truly begins to write himself into existence.
This is maybe the most incredible contradiction of his youth. He tried to join the U.S. Army but was rejected.
Why was that?
The sources cite 2 possible reasons. His short stature, he was only 5'5", and being chronically underweight. So, undeterred, he set his sights on the British Royal Flying Corps.
The glamour of an officer's commission.
Exactly. But he ended up in the Royal Canadian Air Force, the RAFC, in 1918, and the process itself was part of the performance.
He enlisted with a forged letter of reference, right?
A forged letter, pretending to be this polished, anglicized young man he felt he needed to be. He served a mere 179 days and was discharged at the war's end.
And the critical details are that he never got cockpit training, never flew a plane solo, and never saw active service.
Not a single day overseas. Yet when he returned to Oxford in December 1918, he had fully invented his past. He told these elaborate war stories, spoke with a fake British accent,
and famously faked a war wound, sometimes using a silver plate under his cap to simulate a head injury.
It was a magnificent piece of immersive performance art. It tells you something profound about the writer. Faulkner was not satisfied with the reality he was given.
If reality wouldn't provide the heroism he craved, he'd just construct it himself.
Exactly. This intense psychological need to create a history, to build a compelling narrative even for his own life, is fundamentally linked to his later literary output. I mean, you have to wonder, was his need to fabricate his own past what enabled him to create an entire fictional county later on?
It's a compelling link. And that desire to create his own identity even extended to his surname. The change from Faulkner to Faulkner.
The common anecdote, and it's a delightful one, is that a careless typesetter made the error on his first book, Soldier's Pay.
And he allegedly just said, "Either way suits me."
Right, with characteristic indifference. But the sources also have this crucial piece of historical evidence. His 1918 attestation papers for the RAFC already list his name as Faulkner.
Ah, so the change probably happened earlier to aid the deception and give himself a more anglicized, military-appropriate identity.
It seems likely. It might have been less about an indifferent artist and more about a calculated shift to support the fabricated persona of the British officer. He was already rehearsing the idea that the name he was given wasn't as important as the name he created for himself.
So after this brief, manufactured military career and his withdrawal from Ole Miss, he tried a string of odd jobs,
He did. He worked in a New York City bookstore as a house painter, a carpenter.
culminating in his famous short-lived stint as the Ole Miss postmaster. And this provides one of his most satisfying declarations of artistic independence.
He was appointed postmaster in 1921 and lasted just over 2 years. By 1923, he had clearly reached his limit with public service. He resigned with a memo that just perfectly crystallized his contempt for the demands of the average person.
He declared, "I will be damned if I propose to be at the beck and call of every itinerant scoundrel who has 2 cents to invest in a postage stamp."
It's a magnificent act of defiance, isn't it? He was refusing to be subservient to the mundane demands of reality. That decision, that visceral rejection of serving the public in small ways, was the prerequisite for turning inward and focusing on the monumental task of creating Yoknapatawpha.
He closed the door on the real world to build a better, if more tragic, fictional one.
Exactly.
So the post office resignation provided the freedom, and then 1925 provided the spark. Faulkner moves to the French Quarter in New Orleans, which was an absolute hub of bohemian artists at the time.
This transition was fundamental. New Orleans gave him a literary community, and critically, his focus shifted dramatically from poetry to prose. His style began its necessary transition from that flowery Victorian prose toward hard-edged experimental modernism.
And his first published novel, Soldier's Pay, reflects that shift.
Very much so. It was heavily influenced by Sherwood Anderson, who was instrumental in getting it published. But the true invention, the moment he created his universe, came with Flags in the Dust.
Written in 1927, this was his first novel entirely set in the fictional county.
This was the moment he stopped writing about his fabricated war experiences and decided to fully explore the profound, traumatic legacy of the Civil War and the American South. And the sources say Faulkner was immensely proud of this work. He saw it as a huge leap forward.
Yet, once again, the establishment rejected him.
Rejected by Boney and Liverite. It left Faulkner feeling devastated and misunderstood. He eventually and reluctantly let his agent, Ben Wasson, perform a heavy edit.
Pruning nearly a quarter of the text, simplifying structures.
Right. And it was published as Sartoris in 1929. The original sprawling text was considered so integral to his vision that the full manuscript, Flags in the Dust, was later restored and published. It shows you just how much the early editors had missed.
And the rejection of Flags in the Dust led directly to his most experimental masterpiece, The Sound and the Fury.
Yes, this is the classic tale of the artist throwing up their hands and creating something purely internal, unconcerned with commercial success. The frustration freed him.
In the autumn of 1928, after the Flags of the Dust fiasco, he achieved this complete indifference to his publishers.
And he famously declared to himself, "One day I seemed to shut the door between me and all publishers' addresses and book lists. I said to myself, now I can write."
That quote is so powerful because it marks the birth of his uncompromising aesthetic. He began The Sound and the Fury initially as a series of 3 short stories about the decaying Compson family.
That quickly expanded into a novel structured in 4 distinct sections, each narrated by a different character, each using a completely different style.
And he was so determined to maintain the integrity of this vision that he insisted his agent perform no editing and, critically, add no punctuation for clarity in that notoriously fragmented opening section.
None at all. And the subsequent saga that really fleshed out Yoknapatawpha was the extended trilogy focused on the rise of the Snopes family.
The Snopes trilogy, that's the hamlet, the town, and the mansion.
Right. And this is essential for understanding the historical movement of the county. If the Compsons and Sartorises represent the beautiful, tragic, decaying old aristocracy burdened by history, the Snopes family, led by the ruthless Flem Snopes, represents the exact opposite.
They're the new, rapacious, materialistic, working-class modern South.
Precisely. Their relentless insinuation into the county seat of Jefferson symbolizes the transition from a society rooted in feudal history to one driven purely by avarice and modern capitalism.
So Yoknapatawpha wasn't just a place. It was a dynamic stage where he could play out the entire transformation of the South across generations.
With these families serving as historical symbols.
Exactly. Okay, let's talk about the style that makes Faulkner so notoriously dense, but artistically undeniable. We know the key phrase is stream of consciousness. But for those who haven't read him, what does that actually look like on the page?
Faulkner's style is meticulous, intense, and often infused with Gothic or grotesque elements. But stream of consciousness is the defining hallmark. Unlike a traditional narrative that tells you what happened, Faulkner's stream of consciousness pulls you into the raw, unedited, fragmented internal experience of the character.
Where time and memory are often just collapsed.
Completely collapsed. Take the opening section of The Sound and the Fury, narrated by Benji Compson, who is intellectually disabled. Because Benji can't perceive time chronologically, a reference to a smell, a sound, or an image instantly transports the narrative across decades, from 1928 to 1910 to 1900, and back again with no warning.
No quotation marks, nothing.
Nothing. The narrative functions by associative logic, not linear time. He'll write a scene where an adult Benji is watching golfers, and the sight of their white pants instantly triggers a memory of his sister Caddy's muddy drawls from 30 years earlier. You, the reader, experience the past and present simultaneously, filtered through the character's internal agony.
That makes the technical difficulty really palpable. It requires you to constantly reconstruct the timeline yourself. It's exhausting, but so rewarding.
It is. And he took that multi-perspective technique even further with As I Lay Dying.
The 1930 novel, this one is structurally revolutionary. We're talking 59 different narrators.
But what's critical is that these narrators are often unreliable, highly biased, and sometimes they're deceased. The narrative is divided into 59 short chapters, often just a few sentences long, voiced by 15 different characters.
And he uses this fragmented chorus to describe the Bundren family's journey to bury their matriarch, Addie.
Right. So if The Sound and the Fury dealt with the inner mental anguish of one family, As I Lay Dying expands that to cover an entire community, he essentially democratized perspective.
By giving a voice, even an unreliable one, to every member of the family and even the townspeople they meet.
Exactly. You, the reader, are forced to piece together the truth of the narrative from 59 competing subjective realities. It's a collective stream of consciousness. It forces you to constantly question whose truth you're experiencing.
This intense, dense style stood in stark contrast to his contemporaries, particularly Ernest Hemingway.
Oh, absolutely. The sources highlight this contrast perfectly. Hemingway prioritized minimalist understatement, short declarative sentences focusing on surface action. Faulkner was the opposite, maximalist, baroque, dense.
And this difference contributed to the mixed critical reception of his work, which was initially viewed by many critics as impenetrably convoluted.
They often mistook the non-linear structure for mere raw slabs of pseudo-realism that had relatively little merit as serious writing. They were looking for a clear, straightforward plot, and Faulkner gave them a narrative that was frequently anti-plot.
It revolved instead around internal thought, fragmented time, and linguistic intensity.
He just wasn't operating on the established plane of realism most critics were accustomed to.
It's remarkable that a writer so revolutionary had such a classical foundation. Who were the old friends, as he called them, that he kept returning to?
His foundation was massive and deeply classical. He cited the Old Testament, which gave him much of that biblical cadence and intensity. Also, giants like Dickens, Conrad, Flaubert, Balzac, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and of course, Shakespeare.
Let's focus on the influence of Balzac for a second. That seems crucial.
It was essential. Because of Balzac's Comedy Humaine, his massive multi-novel cycle depicting French society, Faulkner deeply admired how Balzac created an intact world where characters and families recurred across dozens of books,
giving the impression of a single, coherent reality existing outside any single novel.
Exactly. Faulkner took that concept and just reduced the scale dramatically to his postage stamp of Yoknapatawpha, creating the same illusion of eternal interconnected history within that small county.
And the detail that he read Cervantes' Don Quixote every single year, that strikes me as particularly revealing.
Why Quixote?
Well, Don Quixote is a satire about a man who clings to an idealized, chivalric past, despite the brutal modernity of his reality. And when you think about Faulkner's primary subject matter, these aristocratic Southern families like the Compsons, clinging to the romantic lost cause of the antebellum South, the connection is profound.
He was constantly writing about noble ideals corrupted by modern necessity, a theme Quixote embodies perfectly.
It's a perfect match.
Mhm.
And that classical foundation shines through in his titles, which he often drew directly from literary history, but then subverted or grounded in contemporary Southern despair.
Like The Sound and the Fury.
Drawn from Macbeth's soliloquy on the futility of life, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Faulkner applies this classical tragedy to the Compson family, whose decline is narrated by the idiot, Benji.
And As I Lay Dying also comes from a profoundly ancient source.
Homer's Odyssey. The phrase is part of the speech given by the ghost of Agamemnon to Odysseus in the underworld, describing his murder by his wife.
As I lay dying, the woman with the dog's eyes would not close my eyes as I descended into Hades.
He uses this phrase of ancient betrayal and descent, and applies it to a journey of poor white Southerners carrying a decaying corpse across the Mississippi landscape. It elevates their desperate, absurd situation to the level of classical epic.
And the dedication of Go Down, Moses, is equally powerful, linking the classical to the personal history of his family and the South. Go Down, Moses takes its title from the African-American spiritual, and the book itself is dedicated to Mammy Caroline Barr, who was born into slavery and who was a huge part of his childhood. It shows the complex, interwoven history of his family and the people they enslaved, placing that history firmly within a spiritual, historical, and biblical epic.
So for the listener attempting to engage with this highly rewarding but notoriously dense prose,
Mhm.
what was Faulkner's famous, uncompromising advice?
When asked in a 1956 interview what approach readers should take if they couldn't understand his work after 2 or 3 reads, his response was characteristically blunt and defiant.
Read it 4 times.
Read it 4 times. It underscores his belief that the work demanded the reader meet the text on its own terms without compromise.
That defiant commitment to artistic integrity faced a brutal reality check, though, in the form of financial necessity.
It really did. In 1929, Faulkner finally married Estelle Oldham, the great love of his youth, and he needed to support a blended family, which included their daughter Jill, born in 1933.
And high art, unfortunately, rarely pays the bills quickly. This financial need fundamentally drove his career in the early 1930s.
It did. It fueled the production of one of his most sensational and crucially commercially successful early works, Sanctuary.
Published in 1931.
And Faulkner was quite candid that this novel was explicitly fueled by a desire to make money. It has sensational themes of violence and transgression, which grabbed public attention, though critics were initially wary.
And he also started publishing short stories in high-paying magazines like the Saturday Evening Post.
Right, to supplement his income. But by 1932, even these efforts weren't enough. The great writer hit a wall. He desperately needed income.
He had just finished Light in August and needed about $5,000 immediately.
So he asked his agent to sell the serialization rights for the novel to a magazine, a standard practice, but every major publication turned him down.
With literally no income stream, he had no choice but to accept the offer of a screenwriting job from MGM Studios in Hollywood.
It was a forced migration.
And this is one of the most tragic and fascinating paradoxes of his life. The uncompromising architect of Yoknapatawpha, the man who refused to be commanded by the 2-cent postage stamp, suddenly selling his time to the ultimate commercial machine.
The dilemma was agonizing. Faulkner deeply resented the movie industry. He detested the commercialism, the collaborative nature of the work, the entire cultural environment.
He called Hollywood a cultural Babylon.
And wrote letters back home that were just scathing in tone about his predicament. Yet he endured this imprisonment from 1932 through 1954 because it provided the consistent, substantial salary that supported his family back in Oxford.
A Faustian bargain he continually regretted, but accepted.
And his initial arrival in Hollywood just underscores how disinterested he was in the industry he was joining.
It led to that classic Faulknerian absurdity.
Upon his arrival at MGM, he declared quite seriously that he wanted to work on Mickey Mouse cartoons.
Apparently unaware that Walt Disney Productions produced them, not MGM.
He was looking for any way out of the narrative demands of live-action filmmaking. He thought cartoons might be simpler, or maybe more artistically pure.
Despite his profound unhappiness, he was incredibly productive, working on around 50 films over 2 decades. And he did find one essential professional ally, the director Howard Hawks.
Hawks and Faulkner shared a deep bond, primarily centered on interests outside of filmmaking, drinking, hunting, and a general disdain for the intellectual pretension of Hollywood.
And this friendship was the engine behind some of his best-known screenwriting contributions.
Two of which stand out as film noir classics. Let's start with To Have and Have Not in 1944.
An adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's novel.
And here's a phenomenal piece of literary trivia. To Have and Have Not is the only film in history with screenwriting contributions by two authors who are also Nobel laureates, Faulkner and Hemingway.
The fact that those two literary giants, with their famously adversarial relationship and diametrically opposed styles, collaborated on a single commercial script is just staggering.
It really is. And his other major noir contribution, The Big Sleep from 1946, was adapted from Raymond Chandler's novel.
That must have been a stylistic challenge, moving from the dense internal monologues of Yoknapatawpha to the terse, hard-boiled dialogue of Marlowe.
A huge shift. But he found a way to apply his sense of atmosphere and complexity to the genre. He was excellent at structure and dialogue, even if he found the whole endeavor tedious.
He found ways to survive the experience, often adopting this vagrant lifestyle in hotels like the famous Garden of Allah.
Right, and he was known to disappear for long stretches, preferring to write on his own schedule back in Oxford when he could.
And we get that great, colorful anecdote about his bar habits at Musso and Frank Grill.
It's iconic. He was such a regular fixture at the bar that he was known to go behind the counter himself to mix his own signature, carefully constructed mint juleps.
It's a wonderful visual contrast. The austere Southern gentleman, the architect of profound tragedy, casually mixing his own perfect drink in the heart of Tinseltown's chaos.
It shows the private world he maintained even in the face of commercial necessity. It was also during this period that he had a significant extramarital affair with Meta Carpenter, who was Howard Hawks' secretary and script girl.
So the 1940s brought global conflict, and we see another example of Faulkner trying to inject himself into the military structure he missed in WWI.
In 1942, during World War II, he once again tried to join the U.S. Air Force but was rejected, likely due to his age and health issues related to heavy drinking.
So he focused his energy on local civil defense efforts in Mississippi.
Right. But creatively, the sources note he found the conflict bad for writing, which led to a slowdown in his fiction output. And yet, out of that wartime period came one of his most massive, if controversial, undertakings, a fable.
This novel was a huge project, spanning over a decade of conception and writing. What was the central premise that made it so divisive for the Pulitzer Prize?
A Fable was published in 1954, and it was a highly complex allegory that merged the story of the unknown soldier in WWI with the Passion of Christ.
It posits that a corporal and his 12 followers mutiny on the French front, symbolically mirroring Christ and the disciples, forcing a temporary stop to the fighting.
It was massive in scope, but structurally and thematically very challenging. And this challenging, ambitious novel won the 1955 Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but the sources make it clear that the selection was rife with political drama.
High drama. The Pulitzer jury, the readers who actually assessed the book's merit, had initially selected a different novel.
Milton Lott's The Last Hunt. The jury explicitly felt A Fable was a lesser work compared to Faulkner's earlier classics, but the Pulitzer Board, which oversees the jury, felt differently.
The board administrator, Professor John Hohenberg, essentially convinced the board to overrule the jury's selection.
Exactly. They were honoring his entire body of work rather than the specific quality of A Fable. They argued that Faulkner was long overdue for the honor.
So it was a clear political move by the board to elevate this American giant, regardless of the quality of the nominated work.
Precisely. And this decision caused considerable disgust among the jury members, who felt their critical independence had been sacrificed to institutional recognition.
And that institutional recognition was perhaps overdue, especially since by the mid-1940s, his domestic reputation was actually quite shaky.
It's astonishing to realize by the time Malcolm Cowley published The Portable Faulkner in 1946, most of Faulkner's major novels had actually gone out of print in the U.S.
So this collection, which provided accessible selections and crucial introductory essays, was instrumental in reviving his standing at home.
It was. It really paved the way for the ultimate international recognition that followed very quickly after.
That ultimate recognition arrived in 1950, when William Faulkner was formally awarded the 1949 Nobel Prize in Literature for his powerful and artistically unique contribution to the modern American novel.
He is still the only Mississippi-born Nobel laureate, and this crowning achievement instantly clashed with the core of his personality, his deep, intense aversion to fame, glory, and the public spotlight.
The way his own daughter found out about the award is probably the best illustration of this.
It's a perfect anecdote. His 17-year-old daughter, Jill, only discovered she was the daughter of a Nobel laureate when she was pulled out of class to the principal's office to handle the sudden crush of media attention.
And Faulkner himself avoided the ceremony initially.
He only relented after friends convinced him it was an important duty. But the acceptance speech he gave in Stockholm is legendary. It defined his entire artistic philosophy.
He began by clearly distinguishing the award from the man. He said the award was given to his work, a life's work in the agony and sweat of the human spirit.
And he defined the writer's job as attempting to create out of the materials of the human spirit something which did not exist before. He viewed the award, especially the prize money, not as personal wealth, but as a sacred trust.
And he took tangible action based on that philosophy. He created a fund for emerging writers.
He used a portion of the Nobel money to establish a fund to support and encourage new fiction writers. This ultimately evolved into the William Faulkner Foundation, and after it dissolved in 1970, its mission inspired the creation of the prestigious P. N. Faulkner Award for Fiction,
Directly linking his legacy to nurturing future generations.
And in his final years, he eventually embraced a role that allowed him to teach and maintain some privacy.
Right. From 1957 to 1958, he served as the first writer in residence at the University of Virginia.
A role that gave him structure without demanding too much public interaction. His final novel, The Reivers, was published in 1962, just before his death. It was nostalgic, almost lighthearted.
A reminiscence about an elderly grandfather relating the humorous tale of stealing a car to drive to a Memphis brothel.
It was a much lighter, more accessible note on which to conclude his career. He died later that same year, 1962, at age 64.
Following a fall from his horse the month prior, which led to thrombosis.
He passed away from a fatal heart attack at a sanatorium. He died as privately as he lived, but his work was about to explode into global academic prominence.
Okay, we absolutely must dedicate time to addressing Faulkner's position on racial issues, which are central both to the history of the South he described and to the critical reception of his work.
His personal views were difficult, often contradictory, and really rooted in the complexities of his time and place.
They were. Publicly, he advocated for the ultimate abolition of racial segregation, which was progressive for a white Southern figure in the mid-century.
However, he was highly critical of forced or fast-moving desegregation efforts. He argued that civil rights activists should go slow and adopt more moderate positions to avoid a violent backlash. He often felt the South needed to solve its own problems internally and gradually.
That gradualist position, however, brought him into fierce conflict with leading civil rights thinkers and writers.
Indeed, the essayist and novelist James Baldwin was one of his most articulate critics. Baldwin strongly felt that Faulkner, like many educated white Southerners, was dangerously naive in believing a genuine middle ground could exist between uncompromising segregationists and passionate integrationists.
Baldwin viewed that moderate stance as intellectually and morally untenable,
arguing that any delay in justice was itself a form of complicity with oppression.
And it's so critical to contrast his personal views, which were undeniably prejudiced, with the depth and compassion he showed in his writing about Black characters.
The contrast is powerful, and it speaks to the ability of great art to transcend the limitations of the artist. The sources note that Faulkner sometimes expressed deeply seated racial prejudices. He's quoted, for instance, as having once said that television is for niggers.
These personal comments reflect the toxic environment of prejudice prevalent in the Deep South, even among its intellectual elite.
However, many African-American peers found his work uniquely capable of capturing the complexities of their experience.
And that's the key synthesis point. Ralph Ellison, the author of Invisible Man, provided some of the most powerful counterpraise.
Ellison called Faulkner the greatest artist the South has produced. More significantly, he praised Faulkner for doing so much to explore the types of Negro personality in American fiction.
So Ellison argued that while Faulkner the man might have been flawed, Faulkner the artist was able to penetrate the surface and convey the humanity, dignity, and internal complexity of Black characters like Dilsey in The Sound and the Fury,
in a way that few of his white contemporaries could match.
And Faulkner's literary impact extended far beyond the American South. In fact, he was a massive cultural phenomenon in Europe long before the U.S. fully appreciated him.
His popularity in France is legendary. During the Nazi occupation of WWII, the German occupiers systematically banned American literature, so reading writers like Hemingway and Faulkner became an active, quiet, political act of defiance. He achieved almost mythic status.
The intellectual elite of France treated him as a god, literally.
Jean-Paul Sartre, the great existentialist philosopher, called Faulkner a god. And his influence wasn't merely academic. Albert Camus, another towering literary figure, adapted Faulkner's novel Requiem for a Nun for the stage.
He remains intensely popular in France, which really helped solidify his reputation globally.
And that technique of building a dense, contained world also became foundational for the massive literary explosion that emerged from Latin America, the so-called boom.
Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha was transformative for Latin American fiction.
Writers struggling to capture their own vast, complicated, and often violent national histories found the conceptual tool they needed in Faulkner's model. The idea of the intensely observed, geographically limited, yet universally resonant world was adopted widely.
We see that specifically in the fictional towns created by Latin American masters.
Precisely. The famous Macondo, created by Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Juan Carlos Onetti Santa Maria, are structurally and conceptually very much in the vein of Faulkner's fictional county.
They realized that by focusing intensely on a small, closed world, they could project the complexity of an entire continent.
And the Nobel laureate Mario Vargas Llosa offered powerful testimony about Faulkner's specific impact on his own education. He claimed that during his student years, he learned more about the craft of fiction from studying Yoknapatawpha than he did from any of his formal university classes.
Faulkner provided the technical scaffolding for modern, complex narrative structure.
Back home, his influence is felt everywhere in Southern and American literature. We have the famous quote from Flannery O'Connor.
O'Connor's quote perfectly encapsulates the sheer gravitational weight of Faulkner's achievement. She famously stated that the presence alone of Faulkner in our midst makes a great difference in what the writer can and cannot permit himself to do.
And she characterized the difference by saying that trying to write Southern literature without acknowledging him was like a writer's mule and wagon stalled on the same track that Dixie Limited is roaring down.
You simply couldn't ignore the massive force he represented.
And that line of discipleship continues right up through contemporary American letters. Cormac McCarthy, known for his raw, maximalist, and often biblical prose, is consistently described as a spiritual disciple of Faulkner.
The dense, complex syntax, the repetition for dramatic effect, the relentless focus on inherited violence, it's all there.
It all builds directly on Faulkner's foundation.
Finally, for anyone who wants a physical connection to this great writer, his home, Roanoke, is maintained by the University of Mississippi, and it contains an incredible artifact of his intense working process.
Roanoke is maintained precisely as he left it. And in his small study, the plot outline for a fable is still preserved, scribbled in great detail directly onto the white plaster wall.
That's amazing.
It is. This fascinating artifact demonstrates the meticulous planning, the day-by-day structural engineering that lay beneath the surface of his supposedly chaotic stream of consciousness prose. The dense, fragmented novels required rigorous, almost architectural planning, and that wall is the ultimate testament to his craft.
So we've concluded our deep dive into the life of William Faulkner, a man defined by paradox. The self-educated literary genius who told tall tales about flying, the reluctant Hollywood scribe who wrote profound philosophical literature, and a high modernist who dedicated his entire output to a single mythical Southern county.
He built Yoknapatawpha County into a universal mental landscape, capturing the agony and sweat of the human spirit, all while intensely disliking the fame and recognition that followed.
His struggle to balance commercial necessity, those years spent enduring the cultural Babylon of Hollywood for a paycheck, with his uncompromising artistic integrity, is really the central sacrifice of his monumental achievement.
It highlights that to truly create something which did not exist before, as he defined it, required an almost defiant removal from the world's demands and a relentless focus on the internal reality of his own making.
And we are left with that final, provocative thought, looping back to his ultimate declaration of independence, his resignation letter from the post office, where he refused to be at the beck and call of every itinerant scoundrel who has 2 cents to invest in a postage stamp. What does this single act of defiance tell you about the writer who chose to create his own world rather than serve the daily demands of reality? Is true artistic freedom ultimately about rejecting the necessity of small demands to focus entirely on monumental creation?
It's a profound thought to mull over the next time you pick up one of his essential demanding novels.